Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's 7 o'clock in my time zone, or 7:15. So I'm glad to be here and excited to get going. So let's begin. So just want to let those of you that weren't in my session yesterday know who we are at the National Native Children's Trauma Center. We were established in 2007 as a Category 3 trauma center in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. We started out as a Category 3 trauma center, and Category 3 trauma centers are trauma centers that provide direct service. So it could be a child welfare agency, a mental health agency, a school district, some sort of direct service. If you're thinking about whatever direct service is for children and families in your communities, we started out that way. And we started out because we're housed in the College of Education at the University of Montana, and back in like 2002-3, teachers and administrators from around the state of Montana were reaching out and asking our faculty and administrators, we have these children in our schools who have gotten diagnoses of ADD and ADHD, and they're put on medications, but the medications don't seem to be working. And the strategies that were being taught about how to support these students don't seem to work either. Could it be something else? And so Dr. Daryl Stoley, that was with our center at the time, started looking around and found the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and then found Dr. Marilyn Wong, who was at the Los Angeles Unified School District and had developed an evidence-based treatment model called Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools, which is a therapeutic small group, 8 to 10 students, 10 to 12 weeks, to reduce trauma symptoms or PTSD-like symptoms in children. There is no diagnosis for PTSD in children. However, it's called childhood traumatic stress or recovery from toxic stress. So we learned how to do that, and we piloted in a couple of tribal schools. But first we asked the question of Dr. Wong, so tell us about your students. And she said, well, a lot of our students come from communities where they witness a lot of violence. Ours too. They are living in households where they witness a lot of family violence. Ours too. They're living in neighborhoods where there's gangs. Ours too. You get impaired caregivers. Ours too. Chronic poverty. Ours too. So we piloted in 2 tribal communities, and we asked the question, do American Indian children and adolescents or middle school age students, do they suffer from childhood traumatic stress? And if they do, will an evidence-based treatment model that was developed for an urban Latino population work for a rural American Indian population? And the answer to both of those questions was yes, very much. In fact, in one middle school of 100 students, 75 tested, screened in as having PTSD symptoms, full blown. So we took that CBITS model and turned it into a curriculum and took out the trauma story, because we felt like we had an ethical responsibility to respond to that kind of need. But that's a different story. The other finding that came out of that study back in early 2000s was that the students were telling us that, mom and dad fighting is really hard to watch, but grandma dying is harder. My favorite uncle, dying in a car wreck because he was drinking is harder. My best friend dying by suicide is harder. And so back in the day, it was really cutting edge to note that for American Indian children, grief and loss accounted for their PTSD-like symptoms or childhood traumatic stress symptoms just as much as exposure to violence. So that changed our conversation. So we were good at training school counselors to do CBITS, but for what we found out was that, like many rural reservation communities, they don't have access to professional staff at a master's or PhD level, and that's what was needed in order to do this small group intervention. And we also found out that you can't sustain and evidence-based treatment within the context of a system that isn't trauma-informed. And so in 2007, we were invited to apply as a Category 2, which is a treatment and services adaptation center where we provide training and technical assistance to American Indian, Alaska Native communities around the country and we work in all of the systems that touch the life of a child. So somewhere in the United States, we're working in a juvenile justice system, a child welfare system, a school system, mental health, behavioral health system, primary care. So that's what we have to do to be able to try to sustain this work and support tribes that are particularly rural to be able to have universal strategies and some targeted strategies for their clients. This is our old mission, but I leave it there often because there was also a conversation in the early 2000s about who owns the data, tribes or universities. And we wanted to make sure that we were very straightforward with tribes saying, you own the data, there's no question about it. That's yours, and we come in only when we're invited. We don't impose our work on any community, and after we're invited, we hope to develop rich and deep partnerships with tribes rather than the one and done and training and hoping. So that's who we are. So why do we need to talk about trauma? I think that most of us have heard of the ACEs study, and we're going to briefly cover that today. But we do realize that many of our most pressing health issues are connected to some of our childhood experiences. So that's why we have to have a conversation about and understand trauma and talk about why trauma matters. So also we have to approach all of our interactions with people, both personal and professional, using a trauma lens that focuses on strengths and values resiliency. We do have to know and understand that trauma is preventable and that people can heal from trauma. So it's not a lifelong tragic, in quotes, diagnosis. We really can heal from the impacts of trauma, both historically and personally, and family trauma. And it really is sort of a strengths-based model. It asks the right question. My grandmother used to shake her finger at some of our relatives and say, "What's the matter with you? You know, sober up, get your kids back. What's the matter with you? Sober up, get a job, feed those kids." Instead, we've learned to ask this question, what's happened to you? But we've gone a little bit beyond that. It's not just what happened to you, but how do you make meaning out of that event? How do you remember that event? How do you integrate that event into your life today? Some of us may have the same experiences, and some of us maybe have more resiliency or more supports, and so we may not be as impacted by the same events as another person. And that's the challenge of becoming trauma informed. So we can begin to talk about what's happened to the person instead of what is wrong with them. And we come to understand behavior really as a response to what a person has experienced. It's learning how to survive, right, as a child. And we take many of those strategies into our adulthood, and they're no longer helpful, but they're so ingrained. We tend to respond to certain triggers in the same way that we did when we were 12. So we have to further understand those negative or unhealthy responses and serve as a protection that protects people, and it protected them at one time. So what is trauma? So because there's momentum behind understanding trauma, there exists several working definitions. We have chosen to view trauma through the framework developed by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, who consulted with leading trauma professionals and experts on trauma, but also trauma survivors to help create this definition. And for trauma to exist, there has to be three elements. There has to be events, experiences, and effects. So trauma can refer to a single event, and we'll talk about that in a minute, multiple events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on that individual's physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. It's also important to have a foundational knowledge of the research that began the conversation about how trauma impacts a person's well-being. So what's known about trauma is embedded in research that looks at how a person's experience of a traumatic event has the potential to impact not only their own well-being, but the well-being of their families and their communities. So as we begin this conversation about trauma, remember that as real as trauma is, resiliency is just as real. And we will spend a little bit of time today talking about how to support resiliency in your clients, patients, students, communities. So there are different types of trauma. The acute trauma is time limited. So it's that car accident or a single incident of violence, a mugging, Hurricane Katrina, it's a fire, a flood, all of that is an acute trauma. It's a one-time event. Chronic trauma is that trauma that's long-standing over time, such as prolonged physical or sexual abuse situation. And so with chronic trauma, we have to understand that what happens if the violence, the sexual abuse, or the trauma occurs repeatedly, those traumas happen over a child's years of growing up. So we may never have a time where we had a supportive adult in our life, or where we were able to recover before another event occurred. And so we can get these traumatic stress reactions before new ones add to them. So young children who are abused commonly also witness domestic violence. A teenager who has been the victim of a criminal assault or rape at another time has witnessed a friend being shot. So experiencing prior traumatic events does not toughen up a child. We want to make that really clear. I had a tribal judge say to me once that, our kids witnessing domestic violence is no big deal. They're used to it. No, they're not. They're not used to it. And it does have an impact on their well-being. So the effects add up, and with each excessive experience leading to more severe and chronic symptoms of stress and stress reactions. And there are developmental consequences to that stress. In fact, a child who has suffered from a prior traumatic experience may be apt to have more intense reactions to another trauma. Complex trauma is early onset trauma occurring on many levels over time, but it's within the caregiving system, such as a child who's experienced neglect, physical abuse, or other risk factors over time with their family, within their family system. So the term complex trauma describes the problem of children's exposure to multiple or prolonged traumatic events, with many perpetrated by the caregiver, and the impact of this exposure on their development. It's typically complex trauma it involves the simultaneous or sequential occurrence of child maltreatment, including psychological or neglect, physical or sexual abuse, and domestic violence that is chronic, begins in early childhood, and again, occurs within that primary caregiving system. So exposure to these initial traumatic experiences and the resulting emotional dysregulation and the loss of a sense of safety or direction, or the ability to detect or respond to danger cues, often sets off a chain of events leading to subsequent or repeated trauma exposure in adolescence and adulthood. Children whose families and homes don't provide consistently safe, comforting, and protection may develop ways of coping that allows them to survive and function day to day. For instance, they may be overly sensitive to the moods of others. They're always watching to figure out what the adults around them are feeling and how they will behave. For teachers, a lot of the times we let them know that you are a safe, caring, well-intended adult. The students do not. And so even your smallest attempts at being supportive or nurturing can trigger that student. For instance, proximity. If you're a big if you're a big teacher and you walk up next to a student who has a trauma history, has complex trauma, it can trigger that student, and all you were going over to do was to tell them what a good job they did on their, assignment. So it's really understanding what those triggers are and what that behavior means. They may withhold their own emotions from others, never letting anyone see that they're afraid or sad or angry. These kinds of learned adaptations make sense when physical or emotional threats are ever present. But as a child grows and encounters situations and relationships that are safe, these adaptations are no longer helpful, right? So it may in fact be counterproductive and interfere with the capacity to live, to love, and to be loved, and to engage in relationships, long-term friendships, not just romantic relationships. So there's historical trauma, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then there's also secondary trauma. And that is a very real challenge for professional caregivers like primary care providers or even front office staff. It's really understanding that working in a system with a lot of trauma-informed students, clients, or patients takes a toll on our well-being. And if we don't acknowledge it and recognize it and develop strategies to cope, we end up with secondary traumatic stress, we end up burnout, we end up leaving professions where we had full intentions of, spending our lives working in. So it's secondary traumatic stress. The working with the folks with high levels of trauma is not necessarily about hearing the stories, though they're tragic stories from children, but it's mostly about those unhelpful behaviors that they engage in to be self-protective. That takes a toll. I can't remember where the quote comes from, but they said, not understanding that working with trauma survivors takes a toll is like walking through water and believing that you're not going to get wet. Just count on it needing to be able to support yourself. So we have the ACEs study. I'm sure everyone here has heard of the ACEs study. 17,000 mostly white, middle-class, well-insured people who were in obesity study who were dropping out. Dr. Folletti thought that they were dropping out because they weren't being successful, but he found out that they were very successful when he looked at their charts. So he went back to interview them to see why they were dropping out. And one day he misspoke and he asked a woman instead of asking a woman, how old were you when you first had your first sexual encounter? He said, how much did you weigh? And she said, 40 pounds. And she started to cry. And she said, and it was my father, and thank you for asking. So now we know that the ACEs study went back and looked at the connection between exposure to particular childhood neglect or traumatic events, and its connection later on in middle age still affecting health outcomes. What ACEs didn't look at, however, was that social context or the local context. For instance, living in communities, for our rural reservation communities, with really high rates of unemployment, right? So sometimes 50 to 80% unemployment chronically over decades. Living in households, right, or in schools that aren't as, don't have the kind of supports that they need in order to produce students that can move on to a university, a college or university, did not look at the generational or historical context for whole communities. So that's another, didn't look at systemic racism, didn't look at any of those sort of peripheral, very impactful events that can occur. There have been ACEs done in Indian country. This one in particular we want to talk about. In the original ACE study, 63%, almost 64% reported at least one ACE, whereas our American Indian population were walking around with higher rates of trauma exposure. We had 86% of us had at least one ACE, and those that reported 4 or more, 12.5% for the original ACE study, and 33% for this study of American Indian adults, tribal members from 7 different tribes. Here's other studies that you can should be aware of. Incarcerated American Indians in New Mexico, almost 100% of them had exposure to at least one ACE, and 81% multiple or severe ACEs, and 53% reported childhood sexual abuse. So you can see that we are very much walking around with very high rates of ACEs, and that, but it's not much. These are limited. This is limited research about ACEs in Indian country. And so it's what's the word I'm looking for? More research needs to be done about the impacts of adversity and resiliency. Why are we still here? Why do we continue to have such high levels of functioning when we are indeed people who have very high rates of ACE scores? So I want you guys to think about how that sits with you in this sense of the community that you work in. And please feel okay to reach out to someone for supports if it's having an impact on your emotional well-being. So here's what we know about trauma that we want to make sure that we really bring this home, especially in primary care settings or behavioral health settings. We know that trauma is very common. Between 55 and 90% of us have experienced at least one traumatic event. And it does impact a person's across domains, our physical, our mental health, our relationships, our family, employment, etc. So just the impact of trauma can be fundamentally life-altering, especially for those individuals who are faced repeatedly with prolonged abuse, and especially when the violence is perpetrated by those who are supposed to be the most loving, nurturing people in your life. And people, and emotional violence becomes central realities, and they adapt around them. Talking here, this is a question I usually ask: what is truer than truth? Because of time, we won't belabor it. This is a picture of perspective, or it's the story. And we all know that there are hundreds of unique, federally recognized, state recognized tribes with unique beliefs, cultures, languages, values, but most all of us have the same experience of colonization. And so that experience with colonization historically led to the notion of a historical trauma theory from Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. And it was something that was embraced by tribal leadership and tribal communities, because we knew that we had loving people. We knew we had really brilliant people living in our communities, talented people, caring people, but we were still struggling with interpersonal violence and addiction and poverty and unemployment. And so it was like, why are we still impacted like this? Why aren't we, doing better today than we were 10 years ago, 50 years ago? And so that it became a theory. So Les Whitbeck and his colleagues wanted to say, but really, are we really impacted by what happened to our great-great-grandma, today? Do we think about those losses, those historical losses and challenges? And so they quantified it and did the research, and they found out that yes, indeed, people do think about their losses, the percentage of time, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily. Daily, people will think about the loss of land, the loss of language, the loss of traditional spiritual ways, loss of the culture. Think about the losses from the effects of alcoholism on our people, loss of respect by our children and grandchildren for elders, loss of our people through early death, loss of traditional ways. But then so to better understand historical trauma, a historical law scale was created, right? So the focus groups goals were to understand that perceived losses of historical trauma, historical events and circumstances have current impacts on American Indian communities. So then they asked the question, okay, you think about it, but does it impact your emotional well-being? And again, seldom and sometimes, let's go to sometimes, because when we think about these losses, almost half of us sometimes feel sad or depressed or angry. Um, we have a sense of, we lose our concentration. Many of us feel isolated and distance from people because of those, thinking about those losses, feel like it's happening all over again. And we avoid those places or people that remind us of those losses. So for people younger than 30, they had the similar historical trauma scores as those older than 30. So it's not just the baby boomers that are experiencing those losses, but it's our grandchildren that are experiencing those losses. And we now know that individuals with substance use disorders tend to be more acutely impacted by those historical losses, thinking about those historical losses. Again, understanding that poverty is a challenge to well-being, and it's not necessarily being poor isn't a sin or a crime or a lack of character, but what happens in caregiving systems is that it's not just their financial resources that are challenged and often depleted, but their emotional and their psychological and their spiritual resources are depleted, and there's not much left over to provide a nurturing environment for their children or grandchildren. So I want to let you know, I'm way behind here. I want to let you know that trauma can disrupt development. I'm going to move past that. When children endure multiple traumatic events over long periods of time, they're especially likely to have multiple gaps in their development. So those gaps in early childhood would challenge the children as they age into adolescence. And if they have an inability to complete the development tasks of adolescence or childhood, they don't in adolescence, and then they move into adulthood, missing some of those and having some of those gaps. There's impact cognitively on cognitive development and school performance, as you can see. There's a reduced ability to concentrate, memorize, engage, and what do you need to do to be successful in school? You have to have ability to attend, to be present, to be able to concentrate, to be able to memorize. So lower GPAs, I have asked people in, teachers in trainings, how many of your students have IEPs because of cognitive delays? No hands went up. How about because of behavioral issues? Everybody's hands went up, right? So it's getting designations of having social emotional development issues, and it gets kids expelled when in their adolescence. Impacts on relationships. Obviously, it disrupts those relationships. Children and adults can be distrustful of others. They can misread cues, both for safety and for harm. They can seek attention in all the wrong ways, and because of that, get rejected and reach out inappropriately. So when those relationships are unstable or unpredictable, children learn that they can't rely on others to help them. When primary caregivers exploit them, the majority of abused or neglected children have difficulty developing strong, healthy attachments to caregivers. They have trouble controlling or expressing their emotions and may react violently or inappropriately to situations. So our ability to develop healthy, supportive relationships with friends and significant others depends on our having first developed those kinds of relationships in our families. Moving quickly on, impact on behavior. The ability to self-regulate or modulate emotions is a key predictor of academic and social success. So lack of the capacity for emotional self-regulation is so critical to school functioning is probably the most striking feature that chronically traumatized children display, constantly scanning the world for safety, looking at facial expressions, listening to voice tone, body language, constantly looking for those signs of anger or other potential harmful behaviors. They have poor impulse control, often utilize aggressive behaviors to regain control of their environment and send the message that stay away from me, stay from around me. Difficulty complying with rules, often engage in traumatic play. So you get the idea. and impact on worldview. So again, if children have experienced repeated stress, chaos, and danger or harm in their relationships and their environments, these thoughts may be rigid and overgeneralized. So they, it's like all adults want to hurt me. No adult can be trusted. I'm in danger and no one will help me. That's those sorts of thoughts. Moving quickly on, we know obviously that ACEs impact the health of adults. A person with an ACE score of 4 or more is 2 to 4 times more likely to develop hypertension and diabetes. The number of ACE experiences, so did the chances of the individual experience cancer, chronic lung disease, fractures, and liver disease. So I want you to think about who are your community members that are impacted by trauma, and your patients or your clients or your students. What are the possible environmental and social characteristics of those impacts on trauma? And how would you recognize an individual in your setting that has been impacted by trauma? And we're hoping that it's trainings like these that help you establish some sort of really working knowledge of the impacts of trauma, particularly on the behaviors of your clients, your students, or your patients. Or I like to say, let's put our trauma goggles on. We're not just viewing through a new lens, but we've got goggles on. We're gonna really have a much deeper understanding of the impacts of trauma. So here's what we don't know in many settings, particularly in primary care, is that many trauma survivors don't seek mental health services, right? They're not going to behavioral health to find out why they're feeling so bad. These vague complaints of achy muscles, tired all the time, can't sleep, sleeping too much, that sort of thing. They're going to primary care providers and they're presenting with physical symptoms. So if primary care providers and the clients may not be aware of the client's histories and the impacts of that history on their health and well-being, and so we began to chase labs and other things without maybe looking to the impacts of a trauma history, being able to provide a trauma assessment for those patients. Trauma affects the way people approach helpful relationships. Not surprising, these individuals with histories of abuse are often reluctant to engage in or quickly drop out of many human services, not just primary care, child welfare, courts. Involuntary and physically coercive practices, such as, you've missed 3 appointments, now you cannot make another appointment for 3 months. It's not helpful. Sanctioning doesn't help. As well, they can trigger trauma-related reactions instead, and are still common in the way that we use provide our services to our clients, students, or patients. Again, it impacts potentially helpful relationships, and they quickly drop out. And just for you all to think about an example of your own personal or professional experience with a patient and what that looked like, and maybe as you think about it now, it might have been about trauma rather than them being non-compliant. So and then understanding that trauma has occurred in the service context itself, right? I mean, pelvic exams for women who have experienced sexual abuse can be quite challenging. So, okay, I think we've said this already. Okay, here's another key piece, is that research suggests that most patients with trauma histories that will not object and will not be triggered by being asked about their trauma history, but will not typically disclose unless asked directly in a safe, supportive manner. So you can ask your patients about their trauma histories, as long as you understand that you are supportive of their and very cognizant of their need for safety, right, and support. So when patients experience a lack of control, they have a sense of vulnerability, right, or powerlessness. And so accessing medical care can be really, really hard for them. I know there are doctors who have said, she's diabetic. I've told her how many units, I've told what to do, and trauma impacts memory, right? So just knowing that you might have to repeat your, oh, I'm so behind. Let me keep going. Okay. Problem behaviors may actually be manifestations or symptoms of trauma. here's again, what we don't know. I love this poster. Being ignored causes the same chemical reaction in the brain as experiencing a physical injury. Now, I used to work for Indian Health Service on my reservation, and we had sometimes 2.5-hour wait times, 3.5-hour wait times for our patients. No wonder they were hostile by the time they got back to us. These slides will be available to you, again, reminding us, because I want to get here. Here's a theory of practice. Just know that you can't do this alone in your agency, and that trauma knowledge is culture bound to that local context. It isn't just about domestic violence. It's about what's happened in the community. Focus on building resiliency, and it's not a single methodology. It really is that multifaceted lens through which we view the behavior. Okay, we're using trauma-informed key assumptions. This is all available on SAMHSA. Realizing, so ask yourself, what does trauma-informed care look like from my position? And realizing it is really widespread, and it plays a role in our mental health and substance use disorders. And it's not just in the behavioral health sector that we need to identify trauma. And again, it's a barrier to effective outcomes. We have not just historical, but present day traumas that we're exposed to. And so we need to realize that's widespread. We need to recognize people through not just understanding trauma, but also doing trauma screening and assessments to assist. And then we need to respond as programs and resist traumatization, understanding that some of our practices within our agencies are re-traumatizing, and to do everything that we can to reduce that, resist traumatizing our clients or students or our patients. Whew. Sorry, guys, I wanted to make sure we got to the questions era. So I think we really have to pay attention to the implications for our patients and our families and our community. And all over the country today, tribes are making a difference. And for those of you that are on this, attending this session, I really believe that you make a difference every single day in the lives of your community members. Phew, that's it.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Zimmerman. We will now enter into the Q&A or question and answer portion of the session and address any questions that may have accumulated in the chat box. Currently, I am not seeing any, but I do have one. So what kind of support or resources are needed, do you think, as we move forward? Do you feel as if there are features that are missing in how we address trauma now?
So one of the ways is to think about those universal strategies, right? So what we do often with an agency or a system in a tribal community is that we go in and we do a survey, and then we do focus groups around these domains to become trauma-informed, developed by SAMHSA. And it's looking at, the professional development and knowledge about trauma, also looking at the policies and procedures. Are they punitive? What's unhelpful? That sort of thing. Developing out with those focus groups, then we come up with what the outcomes and then the recommendations for working in to develop a trauma-informed systems. And there is not one size fits all, and it's all individualized, but it really begins with understanding, at least rudimentarily, the impacts of trauma on child, adult, family, community well-being. And then really taking seriously, trauma is not a buzzword. It's not a new phase. It's not for funding. It really has impacted and does continue to impact our families every single day. And so I'm a sort of trauma evangelist. I really want everyone to really take seriously the impacts and to make accommodations and really learn to understand that behavior and depersonalize patient hostility, right? Or patient, in quotes, non-compliance. and look at it from a different lens, look at it with trauma goggles, and reevaluate how we engage and encounter in therapeutic relationships with our clients.
Thank you. So we have one comment here in the Q&A chat box that I see. It says EMDR, best method in my opinion. Your thoughts, please.
There is, I agree, EMDR is wonderful. If you are trained in EMDR, brilliant, love it. Continue to do that. It's not the only trauma treatment model, but there are many treatment models. But it is about what works for your clients. For example, Billings area Indian Health Service approached us to become trauma informed. And so one of the things that we did was we surveyed all the behavioral health providers because they were thinking they wanted to be trained in TFCBT. TFCBT is about 12 to 20 sessions, right? And we found out that in the Billings area, the clients only tolerated 2.5 sessions. So you make these decisions not just about what's most effective, but what's most effective and how do we deliver it to our patients. If they're not going to show for 12 to 20 sessions, what can we do instead to provide support right away, right? That initial, in the hopes of building that rapport to bring that client back.
Oh, thank you. Another question here. In terms of ACEs, has there been any research on the benefits or resiliency created by certain lower ACE scores for adversities?
Right.
For children from divorced parents who develop healthy independence or resiliency as a result of the adversity?
Right. So there is such a thing as good stress, right? It's that kind of stress where a toddler learning to walk falls down and maybe hurts themselves, but they've got a supportive, caring person to pick them up and hug them and kiss them and tell them it's okay and that they'll do better, right? And so they learn to walk. But we're talking about toxic stress here. So that, yes, the answer is yes, there is. A little bit of stress builds muscles, right? We can't build muscles without some stress on those muscles. But too much is toxic, and that's what we're talking about here. But some of the strategies to build resiliency in early childhood or adolescence are just as useful in building resiliency for trauma survivors, right? It's having a nurturing, supportive person in your life. It's having access to healthcare, having food on the table, clothing to wear. Those sort of things build resilience, even though families might be challenged by poverty.
Thank you. What are some examples that attendees can address trauma in their communities, just from your own personal or professional experience?
Let's see. Well, I see in the chat box that there are people that use meditation, yoga, spirituality, absolutely. Helping families access cultural and spiritual ceremonies be connected to a spiritual source. So if they are traditional cultural people or want to be traditional, having them have access to that. If they're Christians, to their Christian churches. So that builds resiliency. And really, again, it's just really looking at, for example, one of the outcomes or one of the types of violence that we didn't talk about was lateral violence. That sort of, when we are oppressed as a people, we have no power over our oppressors, so we begin to take it out on each other. And that can look like gossiping and backbiting and undermining with our colleagues within our own agencies. So how do I not engage in lateral violence? How do I not, withhold information from a rival, right? Because I don't like that rival. Instead, thinking about that patient, client, student, and wanting their help and well-being. So it's multifaceted. It's accessing culture and spirituality, and mental and behavioral health trauma model treatments for folks, and then developing the kind of agency or system where you are not participating in the unhealthy ways of that the agency copes with its challenges.
Thank you. Yes, and then another comment here, also gardening and growing native food as well.
Oh yes, now nature.
Yes. So in your opinion, how has the way we've addressed trauma changed throughout history?
That's an interesting question. Well, I believe that prior to contact with Europeans, which if you think about it, by the time Europeans hit our shores, their cultural ways or their social and their values were that women and children were chattel to be exploited for profit. And so they clashed with indigenous cultures who again held that women and children were sacred, that they had very robust, healthy communities and families, and and nurturing parenting styles. And I really believe that historically, you know, there's coup stories from, I'm a Northern Plains tribal member, there are coup stories. So it's not that we didn't face adversity from weather or food insecurity or, you know, attacks from our enemy tribes, but we made meaning out of those events as it, you know, we can't control the weather, or we count coup when we are successful in, you know, meeting our enemy. And we have and it's just not mom and dad that are responsible. It's grandma and grandpa and aunties and uncles and elders and warriors. Everybody was responsible for the well-being of that child. And today, I think the biggest impact for us is that we have an expectation that the parents are the be-all, end-all, with no expectation of finding support within the context of their extended family and their community. That we are really, truly, it takes a village to raise a child, that we're all responsible for the well-being of that child, even if that child doesn't come from my own family. I think that we've talked about, I don't think we've talked about trauma historically. We've talked about adversity or understood the impacts on well-being. But I think that that big question at the beginning of the presentation, we've come to a place where we've stopped saying what's wrong with you, and we've started asking what's happened to you.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. So I do not have any additional questions, and I'm not seeing any in the chat box at this moment. If anyone would like to ask anything at this time, please go ahead and do so. If not, then I can go ahead and wrap up. How can a non-health department become trauma informed?
Again, just really getting that professional development, really looking at, for me, it's very much about, this is just a sort of an overview, but really understanding the impact of trauma on the brain and development, really sort of, in my opinion, takes it from it's his fault, he's a naughty kid, or he's a bad guy, you know, he's just a bully, and really helps us understand the behaviors of our clients. So why are people missing appointments? Why are they late for appointments? Understanding those behaviors, making those accommodations. I know I'm rattling here. I feel, but there's no quick fix. There's no 3 steps and boom, you're trauma informed. I'll go back to this slide. It takes time. Come on. Oh, it takes time. It takes a team that's dedicated to becoming trauma informed. It takes understanding and learning about trauma. You think about and focusing on building resiliency as you look at trauma. And really it could be as unique or as multifaceted as your unique non-health department. So one of the things that we do with tribes is they may have the same sort of outcomes or from the focus groups and the surveys, but when we give recommendations, it's always, you get to start where you think that your needs are the most in making change. We'd ever impose anything on anyone, and but it's really a process. And I know it's hard, but it is something, you know, I've been doing this work since 2003, and I learn something all the time, every year, that I didn't know last year. So just, I think just being committed to becoming trauma-informed or using trauma-informed approaches.
Thank you. So I'm still not seeing anything else here in the chat box. I do have some just last minute reminders. Please don't forget to complete the conference evaluation, which can be accessed in the lobby using the notification that appears in the bottom right corner of the screen or in the chat box, as I mentioned this at the beginning of the session, so that is still listed there for you. In addition, please do not forget to rate this specific session using the Rate This Session button on the agenda next to the presentation. And lastly, please make sure to visit the exhibit hall and lounge area of the VFAIRS Conference Center if you have a chance. Thanks again to our presenter, Dr. Zimmerman, for this great presentation and appreciation. USIT would like to present you with a hand-carved trinket bowl made by the Eastern Band of Cherokee Citizens, and we will be sending this to you following the conference. I hope everyone enjoyed this session and learned a great deal from the information featured, and thank you again for joining. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. It was really great to be with you all.